Kia koutou. Nau mai hara mai ki tēnei o ngā Whāki webinars. Mihana kia tātou i tēnei ahi, e runga ngā āhuatanga o te wā. Just offer a karakia to start us off this afternoon. Pauhihiri, paurarama, pau te whakaaro, pau te tangata, pau te aroha, te pauhiri nei e tātou, nau riora ki tātou, haumia hui e, tāi ki e. Reira, kia ora koutou. I just want to say thanks for coming along to this this webinar for Hōngongoi 2023. The topic is Māori data sovereignty and Taonga species, and really pleased to have the speakers that we have here today. Mitchell Head talking about Taonga species in relation to research. Manu Caddie, who's joining us and talking a little bit more about the application in a commercial space. And then KatieLee Riddle, who's been involved in recently been involved in a series of international discussions around both traditional knowledge and digital sequence information. So the plan is to let them do their talks. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and also add any questions as we go through, and they'll probably be around 15 minutes each, and we'll have a bit of a chance for questions and answers at the end. So, kia ora. Handing over to you, Mitchell.
Kia ora. Thanks very much, Maui. Awesome. Well, let me just get the slide going. Kia ora tātou. Welcome. Thank you all for coming today to have a kōrero around Taonga species and Māori data sovereignty. Ko Waio, ko Taupiri te maunga, ko Waikato te awa, ko Tainui te waka, ko Ngāti Mahuta, ko Ngāti Ngāhona hapu, ko Mitchell Head toko ingoa, no Ngāro wahia ahau. Kia ora, my name is Mitchell Head. I'm a neuroscientist here at University of Waikato, and I work at Kotahi Research Institute as a postdoctoral fellow, and in the School of Science as teaching fellow in science and Mātauranga Māori. So today we'll just cover a little bit about Taonga species and how Taonga species work with scientific research and Māori data sovereignty, and the tensions and opportunities with community-led research. So we'll define Taonga species, look at community-led research, and then some of the considerations around data control and access and benefit sharing when doing community-led research with Taonga species. So first, what is a Taonga species? So native species, generally native species in Aotearoa, generally have a valuable resource that a community has a relationship with. And so when the community has a relationship with this species, there's a responsibility of kaitiakitanga. And this might involve the responsibility to want to protect the Taonga species resources, and then also a responsibility to ensure the thriving Taonga for future generations, and the possibility and opportunity there to collaborate with Taonga species for improving community well-being. So this could be through commercialization or some other pathways. So now that we've defined Taonga species, and we can see some examples of them on the left that we will explore further, we'll start to consider, what does community-led research look like? So one of the main things for community-led research is that it is building genuine relationships. This can be tricky, and a lot of people are also always discussing, how do we do this genuinely and build real relationships? And this does take time. So one thing that we have found is that this can be done through wānanga that are face-to-face wānanga. And a point to note is that this should be done on community timelines. This might involve holding wānanga over the weekend or in the evenings, just around the capacity of the hapu in the community that you're working with. But this is community-led research, so it supports the community aspirations, and these aspirations might be to protect Taonga species or for the development of thriving Taonga for future generations. This might be at a iwi hapu or Māori trust level that we're collaborating with, but the research should be defined and led by the community, and researchers should then just support the community aspirations in any way that they can. So some examples of community-led research with Taonga species that we have here at University of Waikato are exploring some interesting native species such as fungi, moss species, and another fungi species. And some of our research from a neuroscience perspective is looking at their effects on learning and memory, cognition and anxiety, and addressing addiction in the community. So these projects were all led by the community, whether they were led by a hapu at a hapu level or at an iwi level. These were projects that were communicated from the community that they had a demand for this research, and then perhaps through mutual connections and relationships that were built, the ability to support the community in achieving their research goals. We've been able to generate these research projects that are addressing community needs. So once we've begun the research, there becomes considerations around data control and access. So the data that's generated through the research, the Māori trusts or community need to be able to control that research data and the access to that data. So this might be regarding mātauranga Māori or traditional knowledge around the use of these species. But this might also be tensions between publication considerations. Very often in academia and in science, we want to publish the results of these research, but Māori trusts need to be able to control the access and the distribution of this data. And so there are some tensions sometimes between science and community demands, and that the Māori community needs to have control over this data, and you need to have discussions around how this information is released, and especially when it comes to IP around how that is communicated, and ensure that the hapu and the community maintain control and access of that data, so that they can commercialize it in any way that they want to, or hold on to that knowledge in any way that they want to. And then finally, to look at towards the end of the research pipeline, when we start to look at benefit sharing, we need to ensure that the benefits of the research flow back to the community. So this can look like capability development, so ensuring that in the research project that the research supports the improvement of capacity and capability of in the community. And this might also look like ensuring that resources from the research come back to the community, that the knowledge and the data generated from the research comes back to the community, and that any resources that are generated can be used to serve the community interests. So this might be through Taonga protection and IP development to support the community interests. So this is just a bit of an overview of how Taonga species research can be done in a way that is led by community and Māori trusts and hapu. And then some of the considerations around when you do research with these communities, how can it be done correctly? And this starts with building strong relationships and working on the timelines of the community. And this might not be within the timelines of the researchers. You know, it can take a couple of years to build a strong relationship built on trust through many wānanga and face-to-face interactions. And then after you've built those relationships, ensuring that the research is serving the interests of the community, that all the knowledge and the data that's generated from the research comes back to the community, and that benefits flow to the community through capability development and resources coming back to support the protection of the Taonga species and the potential development of IP from this Taonga species back to the community. So this is a brief overview from me about the science of Taonga species research. And now we will hear a little bit from Manu and KatieLee around the commercialization and IP considerations after we go from the science pipeline out and towards commercialization and what we do with that science research. So thank you for your attention, and I would like to hand over to Manu.
Ora. Aroha mai, my camera's not working for some reason, but I have a lovely photo here so you can see me and my whānau who reside near Ruatoria, but Ngāti Pukenga, Ngāti Hauo o ku iwi, ka noho mātou raro te maru o Hikurangi Maunga. This is the block of land that we live on. I'm not a Māori data sovereignty expert, but have been involved with R&D, research and development with Taonga species, including with Mitchell. Just wanted to very quickly, some basic sort of assumptions about sort of the framework we're working within, that we all kind of accept that there's these rights, whether they're universal human rights or Indigenous people's rights, and the rights of nature are also starting to come into vogue, and just feel like that's an important part of the conversation. Also that we live in a market economy where there's generally a respect for the rule of law, and that there's this trading that goes on, we pay taxes and we get public services, and potentially there's co-governance arrangements, and other forms of pluralism that are emerging. And just a reminder about the New Zealand economy. This is also leading up to why I'm involved with commercialising and with Taonga. Yep, we've got exports and industry that's earning money for the country that helps us to buy petrol for the cars or electric cars, and laptops and phones and all sorts of other things. But we've got a bit of a deficit there, but that's sort of how the economy works at present. And if we're going to keep buying stuff from overseas, like the laptops or the computers we're all looking at the moment, we're going to need to keep sending stuff offshore. Unfortunately, that whole system is creating some major crises, both domestically and internationally. Obviously, the climate, biodiversity, our soil and water health, inequality, and certainly there's cultural loss as part of that sort of globalization process. So in Tairāwhiti, where we live, 150 years of dry stock beef and sheep farming, actually some dairy back in the day as well. Hasn't been good for the land, as we've seen in recent months, but also over the last few decades since Bowler and even before that, the amount of erosion led to an interest in planting pine trees, and that hasn't worked out so well either, with the amount of woody debris making its way onto property and waterways and out into the moana. And so myself and some others in our rohe have been working on trying to create some other opportunities for more sustainable employment and economic activity so that we can keep buying laptops if that's what we want to do, and create new opportunities using what we've got around us. And so we started in 2015, a little charitable company, Hikurangi Enterprises, we set up in a limited partnership called Hikurangi Bioactives, looking at kānuka, and particularly the oil out of the leaf. We also worked with some hapu around the bioactives in Kina. Then we got into cannabis because there's a lot of Indigenous knowledge in our community, amongst the Indigenous community, around cannabis cultivation, but also working with some overseas Indigenous communities where cannabis is a Taonga species that comes from their rohe. And then, as Mitchell mentioned, doing some work on some moss and some native fungi and some other native plants in partnership with different iwi groups in marae and hapu around the country, actually, not just in Tairāwhiti, these ones. And another company I'm now involved with called Matawai that's working on both Indigenous and also other plants and veggies and fruit that have some interesting bioactive compounds. So all of that involves quite a bit of research, a lot of money and time, but sometimes things come off. And this was our first project, actually, and we did clinical trials using the oil from kānuka leaf to treat eczema, and had a clinical study published in the Lancet, the results of that study, and sharing that with a number of Māori land blocks and with kānuka as a species, as the Taonga, we've dedicated 30% of anything that we get back from that. So we've got one deal over the line and another one, international deal, just under negotiation at the moment. And so that's looking very promising for creating more demand for kānuka oil, and that will require people harvesting it and processing it in our community. Another one we're working on is a collaboration with 3 iwi, and we're looking at all of these issues, and this is really developing a pharmaceutical from basically from knowledge derived through research, as well as some of the genomics in the plants potentially, So these areas that I've circled are ones where there's IP or intellectual property and data collected and needing to be protected. There's potentially Mātauranga connected to this species, but we haven't relied on that or used any that I'm aware of, other than the genomics. As I say, I consider the genetic code in Taonga species to be Mātauranga that's owned by the plant or the organism itself. This is sort of another representation of that. I was going to change that actually to traditional knowledge, but essentially there's different ways of protecting that data to protect the value that we attribute to it. And some of those things have a lot of cultural value, but not a lot of financial value. Some of them have a lot of financial value and perhaps not a lot of cultural value. And so there's Mātauranga that can be held by people and not shared. And trade secrets are often held by companies and can be worth a lot of money without needing a patent. And then you can also within the intellectual property regime patent things, and there's trademarks, and you can build brands that are valuable and things. But in the pharmaceutical world, this is generally how things roll. So there's a lot of information, particularly in the genomics area, that we're relying on that's been brought forth from the plant. But we've also done quite a bit around the chemical characterization, optimizing cultivation, working out how we'd produce it at a commercial scale. But most importantly, really important, is the proving that it's safe and effective to treat particular health issues. So all of that's involved, and that information is held in different ways at different levels by different groups. And we can talk a bit more about that if you're interested. But the other thing we're working on is who owns what in the process. So the UN's got these biotrade principles that we're working on certifications around and ensuring that we're consistent with, but sort of going a bit beyond those as well. And that's the things that we're doing in addition to those are transferring any IP that is collected and that the data so that it's held by Indigenous communities themselves, kaitiaki groups, and also building in benefit share with the species itself and the ecosystem that supports it. And this is a sort of a common diagram used by the UN. Hadn't seen it before today, but have been working on something similar, which looks like this. And that's our sort of model where we've got an entity that's representing the interests of kaitiaki, both the people kaitiaki and also the species and its ecosystem as kaitiaki of itself. And in many ways, these things are kaitiaki of us as well, because we rely on the natural world for our existence. And so we've got a group of engaged kaitiaki, and then we also recognise that there's ones that we haven't been able to yet engage, and so their interests are held by this legal entity until such time as they come in, and we're working on what that all looks like. But also having an entity that represents just the species itself and its ecosystems, in that it's got its own rights and responsibilities to take care of itself, and should be afforded that. And then we've got ourselves over here, or another commercializing entity in the model, and this agreement between us around what happens with any Mātauranga that's shared, and intellectual property, and we see those as different. Also, what access and benefit sharing arrangements need to be included, and any conditions or limits that the kaitiaki want to put on utilisation of their taonga. And then we have investors who pay for all this stuff and invest in research, but all of that gets transferred to that kaitiaki group who control what happens to it around, and this agreement gives everybody certainty about what will happen there. So that's kind of the model that, and makes sure that kaitiaki are really in the driving seat around their own or data that's derived from taonga species. Just an example, as Mitch mentioned, one of them is this fungi project with Rangiwaho Marae, And as you can see, there's lots of different partners and supporters, and but we've ensured that the marae whānau are in the driving seat for this one. The complicating factor, of course, is that Riddle doesn't just grow around Rangiwaho marae, and Y262 group and everybody else is working out how we develop regimes for recognising and including the interests of other kaitiaki in these activities, and that's a really interesting one, but probably not for today. Just a couple of references that we produced. Hikurangi Bioactive's website, they're available to download there, one on intellectual property and Taonga species, and the other one just on our kānuka work today. So thanks for listening. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Last to go. I just get my PowerPoint up, make sure you can all see. Can you see all good? Cool, fantastic. So we've been talking a lot about the domestic situation at the moment around data sovereignty and Taonga species. And I wanted to take our conversation to a more of an international space for the last part of our kōrero before we go into question and answer kind of module. So I just wanted to give a bit of background before we crack in. So my name is KatieLee Riddle. I'm from Waikato over on the East Coast. I've been working at Te Kotahi for 3 years after finishing my law degree with honours. And I specialise in Māori intellectual property, Māori data sovereignty, a little bit of genetic resources, access and benefit sharing, and digital sequence information. So a lot of hands and a lot of pies at the moment. So a bit of background for our mahi, the mahi that I've been on in the last 3 years that kind of contextualises the kōrero that I'm sharing today is, first of all, the Safety funded IP project, which has 3 different parts to it. The first was a literature review of the legal frameworks around Māori IP in New Zealand, and we found that the law was hugely lacking, as a lot of us will already know. And then we did a survey comprehensively with across New Zealand institutions in New Zealand and found that a lot of local policy was missing in these institutions for handling Taonga Māori, Māori intellectual property and data sovereignty. And this was back in 2022 and 2021. So things have started advancing since then, but this was at the time. And then since then, we saw the need to build capacity. So in our communities and our institutions on Māori data sovereignty, Māori intellectual property, and how to navigate these conversations. So I've had 3 workshops so far, one at Sing Aotearoa, which looks at our rangatahi working in genomics and giving them connections and skills for going into the world after their education and continuing on in their research journey. Then also local context training. So we had a bunch of iwi leaders across New Zealand come in, and also Australia as well. And we had some training on IP and different extra legal mechanisms that you can use to protect your IP, in particular the local context system. And then third, just last week, we had a 3rd workshop on Taonga species and commercialization of Taonga species. So that was a collaborative workshop more so, where experts came in, academics, practitioners, students, anyone across the field came into the room, and we had a good kōrero around commercialization of Taonga species and where that's headed. So that's just a bit of background on that. And then we also have a publication out at the moment about provenance metadata. So that is in a data set, there is the data, but then there's the data about the data. So where it's from, who made it, who gathered it, which land is it from. And what we've been saying is that it's important to recognize inclusive provenance metadata, so which Indigenous land genetic resources are from, and forming those connections back to communities and data sets. We've also done some front-end work on the research on Taonga species, so the guidelines for genomic research on Taonga species, Te Honoho Kaitiaki, and we have some guidelines out on that, which you cannot see because it's blurred. But that's more on the front end of research with Taonga species, and then our most recent work has been on the commercialization end. So we're trying to get across the whole ecosystem of research, development, commercialization, what sort of things do you need to be paying attention to? And then personally, I've been working a lot in the international space lately. So at the end of last year, I went to COP15, which is a big convention on the Convention of Biological Diversity, where a lot of conversations are held. International delegations are there. So the New Zealand delegation was there mainly from MFAT and TPK. And then I went as a independent representative for the Māori community there. So I was interacting with them and advocating for us in that space, but also through the Indigenous pathways. So that was very effective and really exciting stuff. And then just a week and a half ago, I was in Brazil working on the ad hoc technical expert working group for the new program of work and institutional arrangements for Article 8J of the Convention of Biological Diversity. That's a mouthful of words, but I'm going to explain what that is, because that's mostly what I'd like to talk about today. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is an international convention, and one section of that law, Article 8J, talks about national legislation respecting, preserving, maintaining knowledge, in particular traditional knowledge, innovations and practices of local communities, traditional lifestyles, and what that means for conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and protection for the holders of knowledge, protection for the holders of Taonga Māori, and looking at their innovations, practices, and encouraging benefit sharing equitably from the use of traditional knowledge. So that's just a background of what the part of law that we're working on says. So it's basically protection of traditional knowledge, making sure it's utilized correctly, making sure there's adequate benefit sharing in place. And it's really just setting a standard for how we should be working with Indigenous people and local communities in research in relation to their traditional knowledge. So New Zealand is a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is great because we're currently not a party to the Nagoya Protocol. If you know anything about these two bits of law, Nagoya Protocol looks at genetic resources in relation to Indigenous people and local communities and benefit sharing and the rights associated with that and research in that, whereas the CBD is a bit broader and it talks about biological diversity generally, but there's a section in there speaking to Indigenous rights. So while we're not a party to Nagoya Protocol, which we have our own reasons for not being part of that, whether you agree or not, we could debate that all day. But as part of the CBD, Article 8J is a really great place for us to be able to assert our rights in the international space and be backed up by international law. So I wanted to go into a bit into what actually happened in Brazil, what that was about, what's happening there. So Article 8J then has a working group underneath it that looks at, okay, this is the law, but how do we implement it? How do we encourage it to be actually actioned in countries, domestically, internationally? How does that actually look? How does that go into practice? So that work's been going on for about 30 years, and we're reaching this new era with Article 8J where the old program of work and the old aims and targets and objectives and principles are all coming to an end. And so what does this new era look like? What are the new goals, the new targets, the new priorities under Article 8J for the UN to be supporting? So that's what we were discussing. And there was a worldwide consultation on that. New Zealand, myself and a couple of my colleagues, with a lot of research that we did, we put forth some advice on that, some consultation documents on that. So we had a say, and then from those big consultation documents, some Indigenous representatives were selected across the world to come together in Brazil and talk about this more in depth. So I went to that, and initially in the first half of the time in Brazil, we went on a field trip. So only the Indigenous people, not the rest of the people that came to the meeting, only the Indigenous representatives went on this trip. And it was like a 4-day-long whakawhanangatanga for us. So we got to know each other. We got to talk about what different issues we're all experiencing in our own countries. And we also went to visit some Indigenous communities in the Amazon and looked at what kind of arrangements they have going on. So in particular, we looked at the production of Brazil nuts, acai, and cassava. A lot of these come with farmer collectives because the Indigenous communities will have their own lands. And as part of that, they will cultivate cassava or they will cultivate acai. Brazil nuts can't be cultivated. They can only be foraged because of the way that their whole forest system operates. So there's usually a multitude of all three or more, as well as jewelry making, fabric, fashion, etc. Fishing, there's a huge amount of industry, but those three is what we focused on and looked at in depth. And we also looked at as we were going, what kind of issues we're all facing together. And something that really came across is the pride that we as Indigenous people have for our whenua, and the level of care that we have that is just excelled to other communities. It's so obvious how much we care, and that's a beautiful thing. And so going into then the priority setting and the program of work, it had that background of getting to know each other, getting to care and show what all our priorities are before that. So from there, we went into these 3-day-long meetings, and two main outcomes came from that. There was the new program of work, which isn't released yet, but there are some particular parts that I'd like to emphasize that are going to be coming out as part of this new program of work. So in particular, there was a really big emphasis on the importance of enhancing and preserving traditional knowledge through Indigenous-led solutions. So as my colleague Mitchell was saying, that it's really important at the moment, especially now more than ever, to have Indigenous-led projects, Indigenous-led research, Māori-led solutions for our environment, because us as Indigenous people are the custodians of our land, and we know better than everyone how to take care of our lands. So making sure that there are Indigenous-led solutions. And also, as a part of that, having the funding for those Indigenous-led solutions. So there will be a fund created, and from that, you can apply for funding for research or projects into biodiversity conservation. We'll get back into that in a second, but I'll finish talking about this and then we'll circle back to that. There's also a new look at DSI, digital sequence information, which is a huge new area because it's currently a grey area. Legally, DSI, or digital sequence information, is not considered to be a genetic resource, even though it's derived from genetic resources. So that means it's not covered under the Nagoya Protocol, which means that it's not subject to those same access and benefit sharing arrangements that it would be otherwise, which means it's in a grey area, it's become a Wild West. And so how are we going to make legislation or provisions or mechanisms around the use of DSI to make sure that it's not left to the side and it is used correctly? So DSI is going to be a huge new area for the UN and the CBD, which we are going to see a huge exponential growth on. And there was also the rhetoric of less hui, more doy. We need less guidelines, less conversations, and more talking about implementation, more action-orientated goals that really show that we're not just talking about these things, we need to actually see them in action. And that's where a lot of the attendees felt that the CBD had been lacking. And then also for the future of the work under Article 8J, we're going to see that instead of it being an ad hoc working group, as it's currently called, it's going to be a permanent subsidiary body, which gives it this long-term, long-standing commitment to upholding IPLC rights and biodiversity. So that's a bit of background of what I've been up to, but I want to really talk about what that means for us. So in particular, the CBD has emphasised that there needs to be traditional knowledge-led solutions to biodiversity. So for us, that means protecting and enhancing our Taonga Māori through iwi and hapu-led research projects and initiatives. And also through this new era of the program of work, there's going to be greater access to funding for biological conservation. So that means research on protection and restoration of Taonga species. It's a great opportunity for us to be really getting in there and accessing that funding for iwi-led solutions for protection of Taonga species. It's a great time for us to really access this funding and make sure that we are doing the research that we want to be doing. There's also, as a result of this, more international pressure to prioritise Taonga Māori, as you've seen this conversation going on, that people are spouting that Taonga Māori doesn't have the same weight in science as scientific knowledge. But the CBD has come through that and said, no, that's not correct. Traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge go hand in hand, and they are equally valid and equally important. And having that international affirmation means that in New Zealand, there's now that pressure to recognise Taonga Māori in the same way that scientific knowledge is valued here. On top of that, they're looking at enhancing how benefit sharing arrangements can happen for Māori and for Indigenous communities everywhere. That's part of the new program of work, is seeing what benefit sharing arrangements are actually working and putting out some guidelines on how it is working, what's currently going well, how can we change it, and so that people can really go to a place and have a source of, it's all well and good to talk about benefit sharing, but it's hard to say what that actually looks like in practical application. So we want more of that guidance, which will be coming out as part of this program of work. And then also there's a huge amount of talk about control of research on our Taonga species, but also internationally, this is a big conversation. Controlling what research is done on our native plants, on our endemic species, flora, fauna, what's important to us, and how can we control the level of access and the level of research that is done on these species. So for us, that's giving Māori more control over what research is done on our Taonga species and how, and with proper consent. So from here, that same meeting of the program of work, there's another meeting for that going to be held later this year to review the program of work that was made, affirm it, sign it, and I believe it should be made public after that. So after November, I think the new program of work will be public to view online on the CBD website. On top of that, they're starting up the DSI working group. So that's talking about digital sequence information and like what I was talking about with this Wild West that's currently happening, making sure that we are starting to have provisions in place for that. So the meetings are starting for that to talk about what actually matters to us in relation to DSI. How does it work and how do we protect ourselves? On top of that, I've got more DSI conversations coming up. We're going to an Indigenous expert international group for DSI next month, and then again at the end of the year. So we've got quite a few meetings coming up to be continuing these conversations. And yeah, super excited for that. And we've got some more publications coming out as well, looking at benefit sharing for modelling data access, control, and willingness to pay in relation to Indigenous peoples and local communities data. So basically what's coming out of this paper is saying that data that shows the level of consent from the community, where it's from, and that additional information that's really important to us is also really important to researchers. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers do value having that information, and they are willing to pay more to have access to that kind of information where there is consent and where there is these provisions in place. Also, out of the commercialization workshop that we had last week, there'll be an article coming out of that. And then also lastly, we are working on having some community-focused IP guidelines coming out for communities to understand and have a better reference of what they can ask for, what kind of things are they entitled to, what kind of conversations should they be having going into research development, and whether it's Taonga species or whether it's for their communities, just making sure that there's some further guidance out there for communities. So that's all from me at the moment. I'm looking forward to having some question time later, but thank you so much for listening. And here's my email and the Te Kotahi website. So kia ora.
Kia ora, Katie. Thanks very much. Okay, there we go. So look, thanks to Mitchell, Manu and Katie for those presentations. And we're into the Q&A session. So like, feel free to put up your virtual hand or just start talking. Come on, don't make me ask some questions. I can do that over lunch.
Kia ora. I can't handle the silence while I'll ask a question. So Claire Wright from Nessie. Mitch, I had a question for you to start off with. So I guess I love the show of engagement and flow that you talked about, and I guess genuine engagement with Māori communities in order to do research. I had a question around funding, because from a researcher perspective, usually that research is funded at least at some level, and so you know, I guess there is money to pay for that research. From the Māori community perspective, from all the time and effort that is given, that's not necessarily supported financially. And I guess there's a question of is there a way to change that, because it feels sort of unfair for the level of effort that's put in, you know, what's recuperated and what's obviously there's kind of benefit sharing out of the research, but that's not really paying for anyone's time in order to engage with that process.
Absolutely. Yeah, great question, Claire. Thank you. Yeah, it is a challenge, and I think we've seen that in some of our projects, that it's taken about 2 years of building relationships and and everyone giving their time freely. You know, as researchers, we've spent a lot of weekends out on the marae, holding wānanga, and the community has done the same, you know, given their time freely where they can. And that's one of the challenges with community-led research, is the capacity of the community to be able to support the research. And so it has taken sacrifices over the last year or 18 months of time. And one of the considerations I mentioned is that it has to move on the community's timelines. And very often that's slower than what an institute or a researcher might want to do. But you just have to work with the capacity of the community. And then we have found ways that we can generate funding from government grants and things like that, that would then go back and support funding that supports the community's time. And just like you said, that they should be remunerated or supported for their time and with money as well, so that they can contribute to this meaningfully. But yeah, I agree with you. It has been a challenge, and that's something that we have to consider. You know, everyone's giving their time freely, trying to work around their day jobs and things like that. It has been a challenge, but there has been grants available, such as like HRC community grants. It was an interesting paradigm in that the HRC community grants go straight back to the community. So they don't come to a university institution or anything and subcontracted out that way. It's inverse in that the funding goes to the community, and then they can subcontract us as researchers to support their mahi. So yeah, really great question. It's something that we've battled with for the last couple of years, you know, trying to generate enough funding to really push it forward. And everyone's sort of just given off their time when they can. It's been a little bit slow to progress, but then once we've sort of put together a really good proposal, we have been able to get funding through the government grants that will support communities' time with money. So yeah. Manu might have something else if you want to add to that.
Probably just add that, and it's probably not very common, but the companies I've been involved with have put money into that as well. So it's not relying, and often we haven't had government support, it's been private money that's been paying for Māori involvement as kaitiaki in the process, and we've paid for the legal fees of Māori partners to get independent legal advice and support on proposals or agreements that we've drafted to put to them. So yeah, I think an ethical company will do that, but not everyone's got that luxury perhaps. Also know of CRIs that are investing in that now as well, again not relying necessarily on an MB grant or something, but in their sort of business as usual, they're trying to budget for capability or capacity within the Māori community partners that they're working with. And we've offered funds for that, and they've been turned down. Other times they've been taken up. So it just depends on the context and the situation, as Mitch said.
Thanks. Yeah, just adding, I've seen strategic research funds being applied to support some of that kind of engagement activities. And was it Hua Tipu Fund is, you know, specifically kind of putting something in place that allows for that initial phase to be supported. You know, maybe not enough money, but there's, you know, kind of examples where people are saying it's necessary.
I think it's the Hiaka Katoro is opening on Monday next week, and that's got 50 grand just for sort of exploring what a research project could look like. But and different to, it's not available to anyone except Māori communities to apply to, which is a bit different to the Vision Mātauranga and even Curious Minds and those sort of ones that were often university and CRI led. And yeah, so it's a good flip around there.
Okay. Any other questions there? Am I going to have to pull something out of my back pocket? Looks like it. Okay, so I got a kind of question for you specifically around. So there's a greater increasing use of Mātauranga in research and sort of pushing for that. What sorts of things you sort of? How do you specifically treat Mātauranga Māori in the context of the projects that you're involved in?
I think for us, we've trying to think of all the projects, but generally, and I don't know if it's been really conscious or subconscious, but have tried to avoid relying on traditional knowledge other than what's in the public domain already. So the encyclopedias of Māori herbal medicines and things have lots of references and information there, which sometimes has source and oftentimes doesn't, in terms of which community have shared what. And then there's just general science that's been done on stuff that, again, isn't reliant on a direction of travel for a particular path of research. And that's not to say that the stuff that's in the public domain is free for all and there should be no attribution or benefit share. I think there's still, the principle we work on is that every taonga's got kaitiaki, and that's what makes it a taonga. But in some of those cases, I think there'll be a generic national entity of some sort that will, Linnell and myself have been talking about some of that stuff and how we accommodate the thousands of taonga species that can be researched and work out benefit share in a fair way for all of those kaitiaki. So we haven't, but the mātauranga, as I say, that we have relied on in one project particularly is the DNA sequence information, which again, we don't attribute that to a group of human sort of kaitiaki, but to the species itself as the holder of that mātauranga and that information. And again, in that situation, we make sure that the species are involved in the decision making through an entity who is set up with representatives who need to act in the interest of the entity and its ecosystems, and also the kaitiaki responsible with rights and responsibilities because it's found in their rohe. So that's how we've been approaching that issue to date. And yeah.
Kia ora. Mitchell, you want to add anything? Or?
No, I think I just support Tautoko what Manu was saying there. That the science and the mātauranga can be separate and can collaborate and build on each other's work. And I think it works well in that way. So
I'll just speak to the Nagoya situation too. We've been working on this particular species that some European researchers came and took some samples back nearly 10 years ago to Europe and were studying it and things. And in their university found out that they'd got this species from New Zealand and they wanted to see evidence of kaitiaki free prior informed consent for working with it. And that was still and they hadn't really done that in the process. They'd gone through sort of the minimal requirements here, which even that, so they took it from a council reserve and they'd asked council and council had given the tick to say that, the relevant mana whenua had been informed or whatever. So there was no real evidence beyond that email, I think, from a council official. But what happened so the university wanted to see evidence, and when that couldn't be produced to sufficient standard, the state government got involved at the federal level, and they basically shut down the whole research program, which is kind of ironic because there's nothing like that in New Zealand that would prevent researchers from doing exactly the same thing. And there's a free-for-all, basically, and no protections other than, if you get something from the DOC estate, you're probably supposed to have got some kind of permission from mana whenua, but if you go into private property, you can take whatever you want and do whatever you want with it, until you take it overseas to a country that has signed the Nagoya Protocol, and then you might find that you need to answer some harder questions. But so that's disappointing, and the need for addressing that is urgent.
Nice, and thanks for that example. It's a kind of nice segue to thinking about Katie, like, you know, the way Manu sort of described approaching traditional knowledge and the interest in the species, kind of here, how does that compare with how it's being thought about in those international forums?
No, I totally with what Manu said. It's very exactly hit the nail on the head, is that it's easy to see that we are lacking in provision in place. And overseas, there is the ability to call out. They're talking about the importance of shame, I think we're talking about in our commercialization workshop. And that is very prevalent overseas. There are different approaches that are being taken. For example, India is very all about being open, having open access to knowledge, open access to traditional knowledge, and having that open transparency, in their opinion, will create better provision for benefit sharing. And then there's also the other side of the spectrum that says, you know, we need closed access. We need very specific intentional access to information. So as we saw in Brazil, they have special laws in place for access to traditional knowledge and using Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous commercial use. And also as part of their lands and their reserves, even in what we would consider to be national parks, or in their mosaic in the Amazon, there are lands that are protected and much like a national park would be. However, Indigenous people have a separate set of rights: the right to occupy, the right to use, the right to, what's the word that they were saying? It was like the right to make a living off of the land, because of the knowledge that Indigenous people are better custodians for biological diversity. There is a different set of laws that go with that. And so on top of that, not only do you need to consult, but even to go into those lands, you need to register. And there is a building on the Amazon that you go to and you sign the book and you basically say who you are and what you're up to. And if you don't sign that and you get caught, then you get hammered by the law. And they're very strict about who has access to the lands in the first place to be able to get into the Amazon where they are. And, you know, people will at the end of the day still sneak in and take samples, etc. But the provision there is extremely strict and extremely harsh. And it is run by Indigenous communities, and they have a huge amount of say over what happens in their lands and their right to use the land.
Hold on. Okay, kia ora. I'm looking around at 2 pages of people here, looking for other questions. Got chance for one more, if someone's game. Oh, look, looks like we're going to give these people back another 5 minutes of their lives. So
I'll just maybe a little ad for the Y262 rōpū that are going around the country at the moment, and they've come up with a Te Aki Taonga framework that I think is quite helpful for thinking through the utilisation of Taonga. Doesn't sort of go through into what you do with the data necessarily or the commercialisation arrangements, but it's a good starting point, sort of a flow chart and a series of questions to ask ourselves.
okay, I'll paste that in the chat, the website for that. Yeah, so thanks for that. So yeah, there's obviously there's a whole series of places where these conversations are happening. Certainly with the Taumata Whakapumo, leading a bunch of those conversations and things happening in different places. I know Manaki Whenua leading a series of conversations around eDNA and how we think about that. So I think there's a whole range of places which all of the different things that got brought up in the context of Y262 are now being discussed both sort of nationally and internationally. So just want to say thanks to Mitchell, Manu and Katie for making time this afternoon to share some information. Of course, thanks Katie in particular for your role in the Tikanga Technology Project, and we just really appreciate the contributions that everyone's made. So Hei whakakapi ngā kōrero mō tēnei rā, ke tau ki tātou katoa, te atapāta tātou ariki praiti, te aroha o te atua me te whiwhinga teitanga, te wairu tapu ake. Amene. Enjoy your afternoons. Kia ora.